Okay, it's picking up something. Okay, good. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started then. Okay, everybody, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Hopefully, yeah, we're still having some issues with the video, but we'll get that going in a few minutes here. Thank you, everybody, for coming here, and thank you for the really good turnout for the applications workshop. We're really excited that there's been so much interest in the Douglas AMA establishment process. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the Active Management Areas Director at EDWR. We have a bunch of folks here to help out with meetings over the next couple days, so we'll do a quick round of introductions. AMA Programs Manager. Did I get that right? Okay, I should have written down everybody's title instead of trying to do this off the top of my head. I have Reyes over here, who's part of our Wells team. We have David and Lale over here, who are part of our hydrology team. Oh, and the owl is coming on, good. Colton Dodson, right in front of me, is our agricultural data specialist. Sorry, Colton, thank you. Teresa Marks is behind Colton. She is our outreach specialist for Douglas and Wallapai. And I think Brandon might have stepped out, but Brandon is our data specialist for the Douglas and Wallapai team. So we've got a lot of folks here. We're really looking forward to today's meeting and tomorrow's meeting, really digging into how we can design these conservation programs in a way that reflects some of the unique characteristics of Douglas. So our goal for tonight is to provide some background, to really lay a little bit of a foundation so we can have better informed conversations about how we design these programs tomorrow. I'll talk about this again a little bit later, but on the table at the back where you signed in, I set out some sheets about management plan development. It contains a little bit of an outline of what we'll be talking about tomorrow in case you want to think through some of the content and make any notes before our meeting tomorrow morning. So we'll get to a little more detail on that a little bit later in the presentation. But again, I really want to thank you all for being engaged and thank you all for being here tonight. You can go to the next slide here. So we have 3 sessions over the next 2 days. This session, like I said, is intended to provide background and lay a little bit of a baseline. We'll talk about some agricultural water use data. We'll talk about the statutory framework that we have for the Douglas AMA, and we'll also talk about some agricultural conservation programs that exist in the initial AMAs and the other AMAs. Tomorrow morning, we're gonna have some breakout groups where we really dig into the weeds of what a conservation program in Douglas might look like. And then tomorrow afternoon, and then tomorrow afternoon, we will have a conclusion session. And the intention for that conclusion session is to really come back and talk through what we heard from you all to make sure that we heard you correctly so that you can provide us feedback on what we think we heard. And we'll also provide at that time some next steps for how we'll continue in the development of these conservation programs. We are really hoping for this process to be collaborative. We are here because we want to hear from the folks that these requirements are going to impact, because we want to have your input and your ideas and to learn from you with regards to what might work, particularly for Douglas, in moving these programs forward. So next slide, please. So with that, I will go ahead and hand things off to Michelle C. She's gonna run through some logistics and also provide a little bit of background. So Michelle C.
Hello, so yeah, just going through some quick logistics in the slides here. So yeah, just as Natalie shared, we are hoping to gain insights and ideas from you as community members on how best to analyze existing programs, and any ideas for Douglas's conservation programs, in particular the agricultural program, which we're going to be covering this evening. This process is intended to be particularly collaborative, looking for your inputs and ideas, and to learn from all of you with regards to what might work in moving these programs forward. And to help begin engaging your ideas, we will begin with reviewing some timelines and a bit of just some facts with you all. So as you can see, this map, the Douglas AMA covers a larger area than the previous INA. This is due to the statutory requirements that subsequent AMAs be based on groundwater basin boundaries. The Douglas INA, or Irrigation on Expansion, was established using a grid system. So when the AMA was established, the boundaries were slightly larger to include the entirety of the basin. The Douglas AMA is the first subsequent AMA established by local election on December 1st of 2022. And the entire AMA is in Cochise County, which is what we refer to as a mandatory adequacy jurisdiction. Okay, this slide here goes over with that last page with the establishment, and according to statute, the department has a timeline for when management plan is to be set in place. This is the timeline here above. This is the tentative management plan development timeline for the Douglas AMA. Today's public meeting, we will cover one of three conservation requirements. That is the agricultural sector. We will provide an overview of the agricultural requirements set in statute and provide a bit of information on other AMA's management plan. We're hoping that this context and information can help support later discussions where we'll dig into the details and where we will want to start generating concepts for the conservation programs for the Douglas AMA. We will present on existing regulatory language from other AMAs to help consider how these concepts may or may not fit in the Douglas AMA. Later in tomorrow's workshop, we will also be looking for any, again, ideas, feedback, or for the conservation programs. Again, especially the agricultural sector. By April 2024, we hope to publish the initial regulatory language for informal public comment. Okay. Again, for this page here, this is the tentative management plan adoption timeline for the Douglas AMA. By August 2024, we plan to have the first Douglas AMA GUAC meeting to perform an informal draft first management plan review and accept public comments. As we incorporate public feedback and finalize the draft first management plan for the Douglas AMA, we will provide a notice for the hearing. We will hold a public hearing on the draft no later than November 2024, document and review formal public comments with the director, and finally publish in order of adoption by the statutory required deadline of December 1st, 2024. The effective start date for the conservation requirements is January 1st, 2027. And we look forward to your participation in this process and are optimistic we can develop a first management plan that works well for the Douglas AMA. And then with all of this, we also wanted to include a reminder about the deadline to apply for the grandfathered rights, and this is some of what Brandon and Teresa and Sarah and Reyes covered with you all today. So pursuant to ARS 45-476A, a person claiming the right to withdraw or receive and use groundwater pursuant to a grandfathered right shall file an application for a certificate of grandfathered right with the department no later than 15 months after the date of designation of the active management area. So if you are using water from a non-exempt well, you should be applying for one of these rights. And failure to apply for the irrigation grandfathered right by the deadline rules will result in the waiver and relinquishment of any right to use groundwater. On our website, we have available both in PDF applications that are hard copies as well as our online submission applications. Again, what Brandon and Teresa covered with you all today. We also have provided those links, I believe, on this page right now for you all to be able to take down. An online application portal, well, yeah, it's available for you all. We also have office hours on Tuesday from 3 to 4 p.m. And again, those office hours are there to assist you all with any other further questions on those applications. Those online office hours, they are on our website, on the public meetings calendar website. There is a link built in for you all to be able to log in. And that's also on this slide as well. Okay. All right, so next up is just going over some background and statutes. So the next couple of slides is just to remind you of, some statutory structures and regulatory requirements. Okay, so the statutory structure for AMAs were established in the 1980s Groundwater Management Act. This act was passed with the idea that conserving groundwater and regulatory groundwater depletion was important to the economy and the general welfare of the state. And in order to address groundwater declines that were observed then, this tiered additive system was created. There are 3 different requirements within the state of Arizona depending on the level of groundwater management. The statewide requirement includes registration of all wells, adequate water supply, and community water system documentation. And then IMA, irrigation on expansion, expansion for irrigated acres, where irrigation is defined as the application of water to 2 or more acres of land to produce plants or parts of plants for sale or consumption is prohibited. Measuring and reporting are also required for non-exempt wells and wells that use more than 10 acre-feet of water per year. And in AMA, additional requirements include assured adequate water supply, management goals, plans, and conservation requirements, grandfathered rights and withdrawal permits except for exempt uses, in lake bills, transportation, and well space. In this slide, you'll notice that the statutes here reference the initial AMAs. The statutes for the Douglas AMA require that we follow those initial AMA statutes as closely as practicable. Pursuant to 45-563A, the director shall develop a management plan for each initial active management area for each of 5 management periods and shall adopt the plans only after public hearings. The plan shall include a continuing mandatory conservation program designated to achieve reductions in withdrawals for groundwater. This visual shows how the management plan, the management goals, management plans and conservation programs are related. The management goal informs developments of policies. The management plan contains policies and conservation requirements, and the conservation requirements are designated to reduce withdrawals in groundwater, which helps the AMA to move towards its goal. Specific to subsequent AMA pursuant to 45-569B, no later than 2 years after the designation of a subsequent AMA, the director shall promulgate an initial management plan for the active management area. Since the Douglas AMA was designated on December 1st of 2022, ADWR is statutorily required to order promulgation of the initial first management plan no later than December 1st of 2024. So yeah, these things take time, so we're starting this process now to try to allow as much space as possible for discussion and consideration of the things to make Douglas's management plan unique. Okay. In this statute also states that if the director determines that it is necessary to preserve existing supply of groundwater for future needs, or that land subsidence or fissuring is endangering property or potential groundwater storage capacity, the plan shall include measuring or reducing groundwater withdrawals. ADWR monitors data related to subsidence and fissures statewide and has been monitoring subsidence near Alfreda for some time now. It's important to note that subsidence is present in this AMA. Additionally, the statute states that if the director determines that groundwater quality degradation is a concern, a program for groundwater quality problems must be included in the plan and coordinated with the Department of Environmental Quality. The next two slides are going to go over just quickly some agricultural water use data. Okay, this slide here is a graph showing irrigation use over the years beginning in 2007 through 2021 for the Douglas Basin when it was an INA. Although not obvious, there is an increasing trend, and I'm not sure if you all can see the trend line, but yeah, over time there is, an increase in irrigation water use. So this slide here, and it's kind of hard to tell, but this goes over water use, types of irrigation, and efficiencies. Oh no, it's super small.
We'll have this posted on our website as well. I don't think this microphone is working, sorry. We'll have this posted on our website as well. You'll be able to zoom in. Michelle, see if you just want to like kind of talk through what each one shows, maybe.
Yeah, so for the first graph here, that is actually in regards to water use. Yeah, so, sorry, that's withdrawal use based off of plant type. Where Natalie's first pointing, that's alfalfa, corn, cotton, fallow, grass, orchard, pecans, sorghum, and young pecans. This next graph here is types of irrigation. The first one is flooded. That's flooded pipe, micro drip, sprinklers.
Sprinkler center pivot.
Sorry, sprinkler center pivot and sprinkler.
Side roll.
Yeah, side roll. I'm sorry. Yeah, sprinkler side roll. And this next graph here is irrigation efficiency based off of crop. The first one is alfalfa, corn, cotton, fallow, grass, orchard, pecans, sorghum, and young pecans. I'm sorry, yeah, just as Natalie said, you'll be able to see on our website the more details of the numbers there. And with that, I will hand it over to Natalie.
All right. Here, I'll try to use this. Oh, yeah, I'll switch. Thanks. That one's being weird. Maybe both of these are being weird. All right. So thank you, Michelle C., for all of that background. What we're going to talk about next is how all of this actually applies to Douglas, which I know is what all of you are really interested in. So we have some historical data, both from the INA and also a lot of what Michelle C. just showed was from the USGS. So we have some information, some context about Douglas, but something I've learned is that what I can see in numbers and data doesn't always tell the full story. So that's part of why we're having these meetings and wanting to have some conversations with you all to hear a little bit of what your all perspectives are and hear if there are any ideas here about things that we might be able to customize for Douglas. I'm just gonna not use this. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah, sorry, I think that's distracting when it's kind of cutting in and out like that. Okay, so if you could go to the next slide, thank you. All right, so the statute that I have on the screen right now is specific to subsequent active management areas. So Douglas is our first subsequent active management area. So not later than 2 years after the designation, which was December 1st for Douglas, December 1st, 2022, the director shall, so that means must, promulgate an initial active management plan for the active management area. So we are required by statute to promulgate, which means adopt, an initial management plan for the Douglas AMA by December 1st of next year. A year might sound like a lot of time, but I promise you it is not. So this stuff takes time. We do appreciate all of your patience, and we're going to do our best to help work with you all throughout this process to develop something that is both productive in terms of the goals of the AMA and functional for this area. Something I would like to note in this statute, if you look in the last line, it says, or the last couple lines, it says shall include, so the plan shall include measures for reducing groundwater withdrawals. So the basis of a management plan is that it includes mandatory requirements that are designed to reduce groundwater withdrawals. That's our major goal here. So any conservation program that we design for this process has to check that box. It has to be designed to reduce groundwater withdrawals. So reducing groundwater withdrawals, which follow as closely as practicable to the program set forth in 45, 564 through 568. And I'm paraphrasing here a little bit. Those numbers are important, and I'm gonna explain why those numbers are important here on the next couple of slides. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the statute that I have on the screen now is the one that references the initial AMAs. So the other AMAs that were not established, that were established by statute, not through the process that Douglas went through. This statute lays out that the director shall develop a management plan for each of 5 management periods. And each of those 5 management plans had specific statutes associated with it. That's where those numbers that I pointed to in that last one came out. So for the initial active management areas, there was one set of statutes for each of those 5 management plans. Whereas in Douglas, we have all of those 5 sets of statutes for the generic management plans in Douglas. So we have both a little bit more flexibility here, but we also have fewer guardrails here, which allows for some more creativity, but it also means that we have more decision points to make, and it adds some complexity to the decisions, to the conversations that we'll have to have here. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this shows you a little bit more of what I mean here. If you click one more time, I think it'll highlight those. Nope, maybe it won't. Okay, go back, sorry. Oh, weird, okay. So what is highlighted on this chart is the options related to agricultural water use for the management plan statutes. And what I'll kind of point out here is this top row says calculate water duty. And you can see that in the first management plan statutes through the fifth management plan statutes, that requirement was present for all 5 management plans for the initial AMAs. Where when you get down to some of these other options, historic cropping program, BMP program, other alternatives, those were added into the management plan statutes at the 3rd management plans for the original AMAs. So the initial AMAs had to follow this series. They had a first management plan from about 1985 through the early 90s, second management plan for another 10 years, third management plan, fourth management plan, and so forth. They had to follow the specific statutes. Douglas doesn't have that structure. Douglas's statutory structure is that we follow this whole thing. So that's what I mean when I say that there's a little bit more flexibility here, but it also means that we have to make more decisions for Douglas for this first management plan, where if we were just following, if it was similar to the initial AMAs, we would just kind of check off those 4 boxes that you can see in the 1MP column. Excuse me.
We basically have to abide by all of these statutes?
So we have choices. Basically what it means is that we can pick and choose a little bit more what the first management plan looks like for Douglas. Rather than just saying that we're only going to do those first 4, we could choose to implement some of these other programs that weren't options until later for the other AMAs.
So we don't have to choose every one of them?
No, not necessarily, no. Good question, though. Are there any other questions before I move on? Good, okay. Conservation programs. So conservation programs in active management areas, like I mentioned at the beginning, our main criteria for what a conservation program is that it reduces withdrawals of groundwater. In the other active management areas, the way we've structured the management plans is based on 3 sectors: agricultural, municipal, and industrial conservation programs. Agricultural is kind of what it sounds like, but it's specific to irrigated agriculture. So when we talk about agriculture in the context of the AMAs, we're specifically referring to irrigated agriculture. So applying water to 2 or more acres of land to grow plants or parts of plants for sale or consumption. You'll hear us say that definition over and over again. There's a reason I have it memorized. That's a really important definition, but that's ag. That is agriculture to us in the context of the AMA. Municipal is things like deliveries from the city of Douglas or other community water systems. Industrial is pretty much everything else. So industrial is going to include things like livestock, feedlots, or dairies. It's going to include things like golf courses that might initially seem like irrigation, but it's not irrigation for our definition because that plant, the grass, is not for sale or consumption. It's going to include things like power plants or mining, which might feel a little bit more intuitively industrial. We're going to have separate meetings to talk about those municipal and industrial categories. Today, we're just really going to focus on this agricultural section, and tomorrow as well. Go ahead.
Good question. Is there anything to be addressed to low water use plants and drip irrigation? I noticed in the other slide, you didn't say anything about drip irrigation.
Sure.
Is there going to be addressed to that?
So
a different category other than just all agricultural in one umbrella?
It's a really good question, and I think that's something that is maybe different for Douglas, that we might want to have a conversation about over the next 24 hours. Douglas, what we've seen in the data in Douglas is that Douglas has a higher incidence of high efficiency irrigation methods. To say that another way, a lot of other areas have higher prevalence of things like flood irrigation, where here there's a lot of things like center pivots or low pressure center pivots or micro sprinklers or drip. We see a lot more of that in this area than you might see in other areas. So I think that's something that's important. That's something that's unique in this area. So something that might be helpful to think about in the development of a conservation program for agriculture in this area is acknowledging that and trying to think about how might we build conservation programs that do acknowledge the existence of those things. And maybe they're more focused on management and maintenance of those systems and kind of getting the most efficiency as possible out of those systems. It's a really good question.
Maybe tomorrow we'll talk about it.
Exactly, yes. Good, okay. So 3 sectors, we're focused on ag. The conservation programs, these are regulatory conservation programs. These are mandatory conservation programs. So they, and the management plans are the regulatory document for those requirements. So the things that we write into the management plan and adopt in that management plan carry legal weight. So that's why this is all important. The conservation programs include regulatory requirements, including reporting information. So it will detail in that plan what types of information is required to be reported on an annual basis, the types of conservation targets that we might create for this area. We'll also include information about flexibility provisions, whether we might incorporate acknowledgement of some variation from year to year, and also information about how compliance is handled. Very generally, reporting requirements require folks using non-exempt wells to report on an annual basis how much water they used. We require information like the type of water used. In Douglas, almost all of the water used here is groundwater, so that's going to be a little bit easier here than it might be in some other areas. But we also look for information about any water received or delivered. So if you are delivering water to another farm that is on a different irrigation right, we need to document that. If you are, I think Elfrida has an irrigation district. If you're in the irrigation district and receiving water from an irrigation district, then we need to document that movement of water. When we come to something like the city of Douglas, we want to document how much water was pumped, but also the generation of any effluent and what happens with that effluent. We also want to document the types of end use so that we can analyze any additional opportunities for conservation throughout the basin. The way the statutory structure is on reporting requirements is that there's kind of this catch-all line at the end. Any additional information related to conservation requirements or other information the director deems necessary. We do outline this all in the management plan. And so by doing so, we make sure that there's opportunity for public engagement, public input on the types of information we'll be requesting from you all. Good. So water use data, when we talk about the agricultural sector, there are kind of 2 categories of folks who have to report agricultural water use. I mentioned irrigation districts. Irrigation districts often pump on behalf of their members and deliver that water through their district. So that irrigation district would be required to report how much they withdrew and how much they delivered to the various rights. Irrigation rights. So the team talked a lot in the last couple hours about IGFRs and those applications. Irrigation rights are required to report their water use. You'll notice here that this says 10 acres, and this is an important distinction. Anyone irrigating 2 or more acres is required to have an irrigation grandfathered right in an active management area. But if you are irrigating less than 10 acres, so if you're irrigating between 2 and 10 acres, you have to have a grandfathered right, but you do not have to meter or report. If you are irrigating greater than 10 irrigation acres, then you'll be required to submit a report annually. So I think we sometimes leave this bit out of early presentations because we don't want to confuse folks. We don't want someone who's irrigating 5 acres to not apply for an irrigation right. If you're irrigating more than 2 acres, you need an irrigation right, but you'll only have to measure and report if you are irrigating 10 or more acres.
Is that on an exempt well?
Part of the definition of an exempt or non-exempt well is that it is irrigating, if it's using water to grow plants, that it's applying water to less than 2 acres. So anything irrigating 2 or more acres would be classified as a non-exempt well and would be required to potentially report.
Even if it's pumping less than 35 gallons a minute?
Even if it's pumping less than 35 gallons a minute. 35 gallons a minute is one of 3 criteria that we use to classify exempt wells. And you have to check off all 3 criteria. It's 35 gallons a minute or less, irrigating less than 2 acres of land, and using less than 10 acre feet for non-irrigation use. If you can check all 3 of those boxes, then that is an exempt well, and exempt wells are not required to measure or report.
So in the case of that 10 acres, so if it was an irrigation well capable of putting out 300 gallons a minute, as long as you're staying under 10, you wouldn't have to report that?
That's correct.
You still have to have irrigation rights.
But you would still have to have the irrigation right, correct?
And that's a type 2? That's a type 2?
That would still be an IGFR. That would still be an irrigation grandfathered right. The type 2s are specific to non-irrigation uses. All right, really good questions. Thank you all. All right, we can move to the next one. Okay, there's a lot on this slide, so I'm expecting that there will be some questions here, but I'll try to go through this slowly. We have several major programs in the agricultural sector in the initial AMAs. The base program is the one program that you saw on that top line of the chart I showed earlier that was included in every single management plan 1 through 5. This is kind of our default program for agricultural users. If you're an agricultural user, if you have an IGFR, this is the program you're in by default. This is an allotment style program. So the way the statutory structure is for this program is that we create a water duty, we multiply that number by a certain number of acres, and that water duty times water duty acres is your allotment. I'll back up and I'll get to that. So a water duty is an acre foot per acre number that is calculated based on this first formula that you can see here. The idea is that the water duty is the amount of water that is reasonable to apply to irrigated land in a farm unit based on the crops that have historically been grown on that farm unit. And when I say historically, I mean in the 5 years prior to the irrigation pause that created the active management area. So the 5 years prior to August 30th, 2022.
Who makes the determinations?
It's something we work out as a part of the management plan. Good question. So part of what we set out in the management plan is how we calculate those water duties. What we've typically done in the other AMAs is a consumptive use divided by an irrigation efficiency. And I'll actually back up. We actually look at a total irrigation requirement divided by irrigation efficiency. And that irrigation requirement includes consumptive use, a consideration for any leaching requirements, and a consideration for what we call other needs, which includes things like germination or those types of things that might not be captured under leaching or consumptive
Where do
use.
your consumptive use figures come from?
Good question. So in the initial active management areas, we have used consumptive use numbers from several old reports from the USDA or FAO. Some of those numbers are probably outdated. So something we would really like to look into is whether there are other sources for consumptive use numbers that might be specific to Douglas.
Do you interface with the universities on that, the lysimeter reports?
We will certainly be checking in with them as we work through that process, yeah. There are a number of different ways to calculate consumptive use based on weather station data and all kinds of different things. And there have been changes over the last decade or two on what kind of methods are kind of broadly accepted in the industry. So that is something that we really hope to be kind of exploring on the technical side on what might be the most reasonable and scientifically supported ways to calculate those. It's a really good question. Okay, so water duty, acre foot per acre number based on some kind of scientific consumptive use type number, and an assigned irrigation efficiency. I want to emphasize this assigned irrigation efficiency value here because it's assigned. And when I say assigned, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to exactly match the actual on-field efficiency. This is a number that we use to calculate the water duty. In the initial AMAs, the general idea for that assigned irrigation efficiency is that the assigned irrigation efficiency would gradually increase over time with successive management plans and lead to lower total allotments and reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. In Douglas, you all already have very high irrigation efficiencies. So I think this is a piece that we're definitely going to want to have a conversation about tomorrow, about how we assign that irrigation efficiency value for Douglas in particular.
So is a producer gonna have to come to you and say, I wanna grow alfalfa this year and get an assigned efficiency? Is it like, if you're doing it by crop, are you gonna tell the farmer what crop
So
he can and can't plant?
it's a good question. So so the crop that would be accounted for under the base program is the crops that were grown in the 5 years prior to August 30th, 2022. So if you were growing cotton for those 5 years and you wanted to switch to alfalfa, we wouldn't prohibit you from changing to alfalfa, but we also wouldn't change your water duty because you were moving to alfalfa. Your water duty would, under the base program, your water duty stays being calculated as those crops historically grown on those acres. So alfalfa typically uses more water than cotton, and you would still be allowed to grow alfalfa on your acreage, but you would have to stay under your allotment, so you might need to do fewer acres or something like that in order to accommodate.
So what I just heard you say is, if you base my allotment on corn, I can do anything I want.
The allotment in the base program is based on the crops grown in that 5-year period.
So for those of us
Historically.
that don't have any history, like that have to apply for substantial
Right.
capital investment on land that wasn't irrigated 5 years prior, so there's nothing grown.
Mhm.
Would we make an appeal to, this is what I plan to grow?
Yes, so in the past, consideration of substantial capital investment has been based on what was intended to be grown on those acres.
So instead of telling the producer how much water he has, you're gonna be telling him what crop he can plant
No,
based on his, with initial use. If I was growing cotton and I got allocated 10 acre feet for cotton, or 5 acre feet for cotton, and I went to growing corn, I'd still just have 5 acre feet to grow corn.
Right.
But if I started out with corn and went to cotton, I'd have an excess of 5 acre feet in that example.
We'll get to that. So the idea here is that we calculate a water duty. We calculate water duty acres. So there are two types of acres associated with an irrigation grandfathered right. The one we've been talking about most frequently is what we call irrigation acres. The irrigation acres is the total number of acres in that footprint of the IGFR that you are allowed legally to irrigate. The water duty acres is slightly different. In a lot of cases, they might be the same. In some cases, they might not be. So irrigation acres is calculated based on any acres that were irrigated in that 5-year period at any time. So if you irrigated one of those acres for one day, we could consider that as a part of irrigated acres. Water duty acres is the highest number of acres that was irrigated in any single year in the 5-year period. So if there is some fallowing that might have occurred in that time period, maybe you're only irrigating 80% of your acres each year. The water duty acres would be based on that 80%. So water duty acres might be lower than irrigation acres, or they might be the same. In a lot of cases, it's the same. But it's important to note because we use water duty acres here for this calculation.
Where are you getting the water usage, the historical water usage per crop numbers from?
So this is a calculated thing. This is an estimated thing. So we're not necessarily looking at historical water usage, how much was actually used to grow those crops. As a part of your application, you'll have to report what types of crops were grown in that 5-year
Right,
period.
so if I'm growing watermelon, for
Sure.
instance, let's say, where do you go to look historically for 5 years, how much water watermelons take to grow per year?
That's where that consumptive use piece comes in. So we would take a literature value, a scientific literature value of consumptive use for watermelon, apply an irrigation efficiency to it, and use that calculated value as our kind of assumed water use. It's not necessarily an actual water use, it's based on a calculation.
Right, but what literature is it that you're using?
Sure, and that's kind of what this gentleman here was asking before. Those consumptive use values sometimes come from USDA or other sources like that, but there are other academic sources. I know U of A has done a lot of work in that area. So it's something we're going to be exploring in terms of how exactly what sources we'll be using to calculate those values.
Okay, but I know you say you want to explore it and you want to look into it and you would hope to, but there's not a whole lot of time to hope to and want to and going to look into.
Understood.
If people have to turn stuff in by a certain amount of time, March 1st is coming up very quickly.
Yeah.
And applications have to be turned in and IGFRs have to be issued. I know we have time for that as well. We all hope it'll be done on time, but we all know how that goes. I mean.
So something that's important to kind of distinguish there is that this management plans process is separate from the applications process. So you'll have to define your irrigation acres. You'll have to get your irrigation grandfathered right, for example, and that has that deadline of March 1st. This process won't be completed until the end of next year. They're on two separate timelines. So you'll get your irrigation grandfathered right. You might start reporting, and then later these additional conservation requirements will come into effect. There's a lot of moving pieces here. And because of that, a lot of our approach for a first management plan, both now and in the 1980s when the initial AMAs were established, a lot of our approach here is kind of going slow and making sure that this first management plan is, yes, something productive, but also something that's introductory and helps kind of transition the area into being regulated differently. Go ahead.
You've talked about irrigation requirements for the plant. How do you assign me an irrigation efficiency if I'm going cotton and I need 5 acre feet to meet the plant's biologic needs? Who determines what efficiency I'm
So
required to maintain?
that is a really good question. And that's something I would really like some input on as we work through these conversations today and
The
tomorrow.
other thing that you don't have in there is water quality and leaching requirements.
Sure, and that's kind of, it's not written on the slide, but it is included. So irrigation requirement includes consumptive use, leaching needs, and other needs. That might be things like germination or other types of things like that. So there is some consideration of that. I genuinely don't know that much about the water quality in Douglas. And so that's something I would really like to learn more about and understand what kind of leaching requirements there might be in this area.
Now, am I correct? This plan is gonna be implemented the 1st of December of 2024. But then in January of 2027, it's able to be.
It's confusing. Yeah, the dates are confusing. So by statute, we are required to adopt a management plan by the end of next year. By a year and a couple days from now. Yeah. But also by statute, the requirements contained in a management plan don't go into effect until at least 2 years after that management plan is adopted.
That's the.
So there's,
2027.
right, so there's a transition period there. So say we adopt the management plan on December 1st, we could theoretically have those requirements go into effect on December 1st of 2026. But it wouldn't make sense for us from a reporting standpoint to have a partial year of that regulation in place. So we always shift that date to the beginning of the next calendar year. So it's a full reporting year. So that's why it's shifted to January 1st instead of December 1st. I think it was maybe the next slide. No, maybe not. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, you can, oh no, I saw it. You went right by it.
But after December 1st of 2024, then the plan is already kind of set in stone.
So the plan is finalized then, it would be set in stone then, but the actual conservation requirements, you wouldn't be required to comply with those until January
I
1st,
just didn't know if there
2027.
was like a period there that if something wasn't working, that it could be changed or.
So that is a really good question. So the process for the adoption of a management plan is that we adopt the management plan, and within 30 days of adopting that management plan, we're required to send out notices to every right holder in that active management area who's impacted by those conservation requirements. So from the date that we send out those notices, there is 90 days from the date of the notice to apply for what we call administrative review or a variance. Administrative review is requesting a change to your conservation requirements. A variance is requesting an extension up to 5 years for your conservation requirements. So there is, even as we have kind of standard things written in stone into the management plan, there's opportunity for individual exceptions where there might be extenuating circumstances. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madison. Okay, go back one. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about the water duty. We talked about the water duty acres. Water duty, so the acre foot per acre number is multiplied by acres to get a total allotment. Just because we calculated it on an acre foot per acre basis, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a calculation. We calculate a total allotment, and you can use that total allotment on your irrigation acres as you see fit. So say you have 100 acres and a 500 acre foot allotment. You could choose to put all of your allotment on half of your acres and you could still be in compliance. That how you distribute that water across your irrigation acres doesn't matter as long as you're reporting accurately.
What happens if you don't use your allotted acre feet every year?
I've got a slide for that. And that's actually what this last line on the slide here is about. There is a flexibility account, and this is, again, a lot of this in this particular program is statutory. The reason I'm describing this the way that I am is a number of these things are kind of laid out in statute. There's less flexibility in the precise calculations in the way we operate the flexibility accounts for the base program than there might be in some of the other programs where we have more free reign to design things. The water duty has to be based on those historic crops, it has to be kind of a reasonable amount. It's irrigation requirement divided by irrigation efficiency. We have some flexibility in how we calculate that irrigation requirement. We have some flexibility in what we assign as an irrigation efficiency, but it has to kind of still have that same general structure. Water duty acres, that's statutory. Can't change that. It's going to be water duty times water duty acres.
So
Go ahead.
the question's still on the table. What happens if I don't use my acres?
I'm getting there.
Okay.
Flex accounts are also in statute. So the bit that I'm about to describe here, this is laid out in statute. This applies across the board. This, with a base program, this would exist as written. Next slide, please. So the way a flex account for an IGFR works is that we maintain an account for each irrigation grandfathered right. That grandfathered right is assigned a total allotment. And when you report your use each year, we calculate how much over or under you might have gone as compared to that allotment in your water use. And according to whether you went under or over, we might credit or debit your flex account. An irrigation grandfathered right is considered to be out of compliance if they go deeper in the debit category than negative 50% in that flexibility account as compared to their total allotment. So there's quite a bit of flexibility in that structure. The other piece of that is that credits accrued in a single year can be sold. So someone who is,
sold?
they can be sold. So someone that is out of compliance on their flex account went to negative 52% can purchase credits from someone else to bring themselves back into compliance. There's limitations on that though, because there's limitations on everything. So a credit can only be sold in the second calendar year after it's accrued. And that timeline can get really confusing. Colton and I have been working on a graphic for that. We're a little bit behind on that. I was hoping to have that done, but I didn't get a chance to finalize that.
Are you the fiduciary for that transaction?
ADWR records those transactions. It is a private negotiation between the two parties.
You tell party one that party two has acres?
We have queries available on our website that list who might have saleable flex credits available. Yes.
You got a base price?
We do not. That is entirely a private contractual thing. We don't necessarily have a lot of visibility to what the prices are. We don't have any authority to regulate those prices. That's a private thing. We just record the actual transaction.
So if you could go to a deficit for 50%, so if you went 45%, could you do that forever?
So this is a cumulative thing. So if you went negative 11% 5 years in a row, you would be out of compliance, for example, because it adds on itself.
And what happens when you're out of compliance?
ADWR does have enforcement authority. Under our regulatory structure, groundwater withdrawals that are out of compliance or are illegal in some way can be subject to fines of up to $10,000 a day. So there are significant potential fines associated with out of compliance water usage. Our major compliance strategy is to not go so heavy on people because that's a lot of money. And our goal is not to bring in money. Our goal is to manage the water. So very often our approach to compliance is that we work with folks to, instead of bringing that money to us, we say, okay, here's what your fine would have been. We want you to invest that money in restructuring your operations so that you can operate within compliance.
When you take the money, where does the money go?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to check in with our compliance folks or finance folks about that. I'm not sure about that.
I would assume statutorily,
I think
there's
it,
somewhere,
yeah, I think it goes to general fund, but I'm not positive about
yeah,
that.
we can look at that.
Yeah,
That would be interesting legislatively.
yeah. I don't believe it's something that directly benefits the department.
That's not what I was, I'm
Oh,
looking at legislative control over what those fines are. If they're getting the money and somebody sees a source, some money, they're gonna wanna mine that money.
Fair enough.
Legislators.
Good. Did that answer your question about the flex accounts? Good. Okay. Another major topic of conversation for tomorrow is going to be these other agricultural conservation requirements. So very generally, we do have requirements for districts. Typically, our requirements for irrigation districts tend to be things like conveyance losses, lost and unaccounted for water, making sure that water isn't being lost through leaky canals or things like that in a way that might be wasteful. But we also have other alternative programs in the other AMAs that have been adopted over time. You'll see here that I have listed some of these programs were adopted as a part of the 3rd management plans in the initial AMAs. There's one brand new one that was adopted as a part of the 5th management plans in the initial AMAs. But we don't necessarily have to follow that same 1 through 5 structure in Douglas, like I said at the beginning. So since we don't have to follow that 1 through 5 structure, we could choose to implement one or more of these programs, or we could choose to design something completely customized, completely brand new for Douglas as an alternative program. We would still have the base program as kind of our default, but we could, if we choose to, if there are ideas out there, choose to adopt an alternative program or design a brand new alternative program, or some combination of those things. I'll talk a little bit more about some of these programs on the next slide, but what I want to note here is the historic cropping program is one that we often don't talk about much. And the reason we don't talk about it much is because in its entire history, nobody has opted to participate in it. So what we've kind of realized is that it was designed for a very small niche group, and most folks have chosen not to be a part of that very small niche group. The general design of the historic cropping program is that you can opt to be assigned an irrigation efficiency of 75% if you comply with a whole series of other requirements. And most folks have just opted not to do that. So we can certainly provide additional information on that program, but at least what we've seen in our experience from that program in the past is that it's a pretty limited utility.
How do you monitor and certify irrigation efficiencies?
So again, the irrigation efficiencies is not necessarily based on-farm actual efficiency. It's a number that we assign to use to calculate. What I'll note there is that we want to be realistic about it. We want to make sure that whatever we assign is actually reasonable and achievable for a given area. In the initial active management areas, when they were assigning irrigation efficiencies, they looked pretty broadly at things like the types of irrigation methods being used in a given area, soil types in a given area, and they created what they called areas of similar farming conditions. And they would look at areas of similar farming conditions and kind of across that broader geographic area would assign similar or identical irrigation efficiencies across that area. We can certainly consider doing something similar here, and that would be something we would want input in on. What would those areas of similar farming conditions be in the Douglas area?
So within the Douglas AMA, there could be different areas that, oh, okay.
Yeah, it would be kind of smaller geographic divisions of the Douglas AMA that we might call different areas of similar farming conditions, yes.
Have you ever done those by post?
Sorry, go ahead, you're fine.
I was just wondering if you've ever utilized soil type as.
Soil types and slopes was something that was considered as a part of those original areas of similar farming conditions, yes.
The water due that's assigned, you know, in the first management plan, is that the water due that would go with that acreage for 25 years, or does it change?
So that would be the water duty that would go with that acreage for the duration of that management plan.
So every 5 years?
Every 10 years, as the goal's currently written, yes. Yeah. So the idea there, I kind of mentioned this really briefly at the beginning. The idea there is in the initial AMAs that the assigned irrigation efficiency that was assigned to calculate that water duty would increase over time, and thus would bring the allotment down over time, checks that box of reducing withdrawals of groundwater over time, right? Is that functional here? Maybe less so, because irrigation efficiencies are already really high. So perhaps there's something else we would need to consider here in terms of checking that box of reducing withdrawals of groundwater.
Now, does the ADWR know why our efficiencies are high compared to other?
It's really a function of a lot of folks have adopted more efficient technologies here. I don't know why exactly more folks have opted into that in this area. Yeah, no, I'm not really sure, but it's something that we've definitely observed in the data, that there's a lot more. You can look at the satellite imagery and there's a lot of big circles, right? There's a lot more center pivots in this area as compared to even the Phoenix AMA or the Pinal AMA.
Something to be proud of.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that's interesting.
AMA is also served by the solar project. And
Sure.
those gallons of water sprinkled there, flood irrigated.
Sure. Yep.
And they're attached to the land.
Yep.
I got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you guys own the wells that you collect the data from, as far as?
No. ADWR is looking into potentially drilling some wells that we would own, and having some ADWR owned monitor wells.
To back up the data for.
Right. But at this time, we don't own any wells. The wells that we collect data from are all on a volunteer basis. So if any of you are interested in volunteering your wells to be monitored by our hydro group, they're always. I could check with our chief hydrologist and find out whether that could be useful too. There's all types of information that we're able to gather from wells. And we do really broad monitoring across the state of things like water levels and a lot of other information that I'm sure David and Lale could talk about a lot more clearly than I could. But our hydro group is always looking for additional wells to monitor, and we're glad to provide that information back to the well owner. If you'll allow us to do some pump testing and that kind of thing on the well, we'll gladly provide that information back to the well owner.
Is that only on non-exempt or exempt?
I think we're able to do that on exempt and non-exempt. Typically, we look for wells that aren't actively in use, because the pumping can obviously do things to change the water levels. But I believe they're able to monitor both exempt and non-exempt wells. Go ahead.
Do you manage the water, or does the state own the water?
So this is a messy one, and I'm looking at the attorney in the room because I don't want to misstate this. The water in Arizona is not owned until the point at which it is being beneficially used. So the state has authority to regulate and manage the water, but it is not owned until it is being used.
So there's no option for the constitutionality of the state cannot give anything away, hence they have to charge for it. So you're saying you don't own the water, so you can't charge, you don't have to charge for it.
So the state, the water, it's a little bit hard to explain without going like deeply into the legal language. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm newer to groundwater. I work with surface water. Surface water is held by the state in trust for the people of Arizona. So technically, it's owned by the citizens of Arizona. The government manages it for you all. Groundwater, I think, is a little bit different. And I think Natalie
Right.
hit it. It's not owned by anyone until it's captured and put to use.
So for example, what that means is you have your piece of property. That water underneath that property is not owned by you. It's not owned by the state. It's not owned by anybody. But once you use your well to pump that water up and you apply it to a field, then it is owned by you because you've withdrawn it and put it to use.
So does that make me liable for polluting it? With nitrites and that?
I probably shouldn't answer that question. Good attorney
The
answer,
genesis
like
of my
it.
question is, this issue is coming up with the Rural Water Association Foundation in Wilcox on ownership of the water, the way it's working out.
Right.
Is there?
And that same thing I said about the ownership of the water, that applies statewide. That's not specific to active management areas.
Okay, so you manage it, you don't.
Right.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Good, okay. Let's go to the next slide here. What is shown on this slide here is really just a description of how the different conservation programs in the other AMAs kind of end up playing out with relation to each other. So in the other initial AMAs, in the initial AMAs, we have kind of 3 programs that folks have either already participated in or that we expect folks to participate in. So the Integrated Farm Program is a brand new program for the 5th management plan. We adopted the 5th management plans last year. Sorry, I'm losing track of my timelines. We adopted the 5th management plans last year, and so those conservation requirements will go into effect in 2025. So that's not in effect yet, but we've already got some inquiries about folks wanting to participate in it. So I'll explain a little bit the difference between these. So base program we've already talked about. It's an allotment style program. You get a volume of water that you're allowed to use on each irrigation grandfathered right. The best management practices program requires specific conservation management and maintenance practices rather than an allotment. And it allows you to combine multiple IGFRs under a single report. So if you're farming multiple irrigation grandfathered rights, multiple pieces of land, you can submit one report instead of submitting 5 reports. The Integrated Farm Program is intended to be kind of a middle ground between these 2 things. It allows you to do the combined reporting thing by by basically taking your allotment from each of your however many parcels and combining it, but it has what we call a cut to the aquifer. So we combine the total allotments from all your parcels. You can use that total allotment across those grandfathered rights, all of those grandfathered rights as you see fit, but there's a small reduction to that total allotment as compared to if it had just been a sum. And again, we're checking that box of reductions and withdrawals of groundwater. So that's the source of that cut to the aquifer piece. The benefit of the Integrated Farm Program is that it allows that combined reporting piece. There's a little bit less of a regulatory burden there without requiring additional reporting and very specific practices like the Best Management Practices Program would require. So there's a little bit, in this way, there's a little bit of a spectrum of options in the initial active management areas. We could choose in Douglas to do something like this, or since this is the first management plan, we could choose in Douglas to just start with a base program. This is the conversation we really came down here for this week, to dig into this, to consider what the options are for Douglas, what makes sense for Douglas. And we really want to think carefully about how this all applies here, what is unique about Douglas, and what we might need to customize for this area. Do I have another one? Okay, let's see. Yeah. And that kind of brings us back to where we started. We are going to hold a series of these types of meetings. We're gonna try to have a workshop style or a really interactive style meeting for each sector, although municipal and industrial are obviously a little bit different in this area where we don't expect it to be as big. We might hold those virtually or do those a little bit differently than we've done agriculture, but we thought it was really important for us to be here in person, particularly for this agricultural conversation, because we know that this is important for this area. We really wanted to lay out a little bit of a guardrail because we don't have those statutory requirements. We don't have those statutory guardrails in the same way as the initial AMAs do. We wanted to lay out some basic principles. So we have our really mandatory one that is reducing groundwater withdrawals. That's our statutory requirement. That's our one box we have to check. But our other principle that we really have for this is that it's kind of a transitional thing, that we have an opportunity here to educate on what these requirements are. And we have an opportunity to start to introduce these requirements that moves start to introduce these requirements in a way that moves the AMA in the right direction. So we can do a lot more education and outreach through this process, and we can also start to introduce some basic conservation requirements through this first management plan, rather than trying to go full force and having something really complicated that folks are going to get confused about. So I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah. We had laid some of this out in one of our previous meetings as we kind of talked through the general structure of the management plan. Chapter 4 in our management plans has traditionally been the agricultural chapter. So we laid out here a little bit of a first thought on what that chapter 4 might look like. We would include that base program. We would include some kind of base level starting conservation programs as requirements as a transitional thing. And if there's interest, we could include something that's customized for Douglas. Or if there's one of the other options on the list that it seems like would be a good fit here, we'd be interested in talking about that. Go to the next slide. So sorry, you can go back to the last one. I wanted to go back a little bit. So what we'll be doing tomorrow is really digging into all of this. I mentioned at the beginning that I have these handouts at the back table. What these do, we will use these handouts at the workshop tomorrow to talk in more detail. We'll have 3 kind of breakout groups, one for each category. So there's a category for base program, a category for other existing options, and a category for other. And this other category is really just thinking more broadly about what characteristics or goals would a program that would be specific to Douglas include. We want to hear from you all we've laid out some of our principles, and we'd be interested in hearing from all of you on what are your baseline principles, what are your baseline requirements for a conservation program for Douglas. Go ahead.
Whitewater wildlife area, they pump a lot of water to fill ponds with a bunch of birds. Are they industrial or are they agriculture?
They would be considered to be industrial.
And how do they get regulated?
That's a really good question. I think that would be something that we could consider as a part of the industrial category.
They pump a lot of water.
I don't know that we have a very close analog to that in the other active management areas. I'll have to look into that.
Well, I can tell you they retain water illegally.
Well, we can also have a conversation about that, and I'd be happy to pass any information along to our compliance team.
And
I don't have,
you said that golf courses are industrial also?
Correct, right. Yeah, good. You can go ahead and go to the next one. Okay, so we have 2 more sessions in the next couple days. Workshop that I've talked about a number of times here from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. tomorrow. And then that conclusion section where we'll really just come back and kind of wrap everything up, make sure that we've clearly understood the types of input that you all have, and talk about next steps. I'm going to hand things off to Michelle C. And do I have one more slide? Sorry, I've lost track of my script here.
No, you're good.
Oh, did I get ahead of myself? Sorry about
It's
that.
okay.
Okay, so, nope, I was thinking I had more there. Sorry, Michelle C.
That's fine.
Okay, so workshop, if you'll go to the next slide. One more. Workshop topics. This slide really shows kind of exactly what we have laid out on this sheet. So we want to have a little bit of a discussion. Would the way these were structured in the initial AMAs work for Douglas, or what changes do they need? Why would they not work the same as in the initial A's, or why would they not work? We want to kind of unpack that a little bit. Considering the base program, considering these alternative options, what characteristics or details specific to Douglas might need to be considered as a part of these? And I think the thing I've already heard coming up a lot today is that irrigation efficiency thing, I think, and also the consumptive use piece. I think that's something we're really going to want to explore tomorrow. Do you have anything to add? What did I miss?
Just the format. So the format is going to be, the morning sessions are going to be, again, 3 different breakout groups that are going to be focused on, focused on these bullet points, the base program default with those subcategories. The options with the subcategories is going to be a second breakout group. And then the third one is going to be the other, which is that open discussion of what you all think should be a part of the ag sections management plan. All 30 minutes, and then you're going to rotate into the next breakout section, and that's going to follow through till you've gone to each of those breakout sessions. Of course, with a little bit of time, if you all need time to transition or have like discussions that may go further. So that will be 3 hours in the morning. And then just a 2-hour break, and then come back around to recap some of those main themes from each of those breakout sessions, hear more from you all to flush out those discussions further, and any other feedback that you all might have.
Good. Thank you.
So basically, you're gonna let us know the base program and how it works, and then some of the other programs, and then you're gonna take our input.
Yeah. So what we'll do is kind of sit down, and for example, if you're at the table that's focusing on the base program, we'll say, okay, let's talk through that water duty calculation. Do you have any ideas or information on how we might go about learning more about options for consumptive use calculations, or information about water quality so we can learn more about leaching requirements in this area? Or we might say irrigation, let's talk about irrigation efficiencies and how we might consider assigning irrigation efficiencies in this area. Are there areas of similar farming conditions that we could consider? So we'll kind of talk through each line item as a part of that category. In the other existing options, we'll talk through best management practices and integrated farming practices, so on.
And when you're saying that the goal is the reduction of groundwater
Withdrawals.
you all start with your numbers, what you know right today that's being withdrawn in the basin?
Right, yeah, we would base that off of now. Good. I think we can go to the next. Oh, sorry, one last thing here. I did want to note. We have a note here on the bottom. Excuse me. I've been talking too much. There is a deadline for additional comments. So if you walk out of that meeting tomorrow and a day later you're like, oh, I wish I would have given this idea or this piece of feedback, we ask that any additional comments related to agricultural conservation programs come in by December 8th. Even if it's scribbles on this type of sheet or a quick email or something along those lines, we welcome any additional input that you all might have. Cool. So we're about 30 minutes early, which I think is a first for this area. Are there any additional questions?
You gonna turn the heater on tomorrow?
What was that?
You gonna turn the heater on tomorrow?
We can ask to turn the heater on. Yeah, it's chilly. Yeah. Sure, good. All right, well, folks, thank you so much for your time tonight, thank you in advance for your time tomorrow. I really appreciate all of the questions. They've been really great questions, and we're looking forward to working with you all some more. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.